Saul Bass was the great genius of movie credits.
Hitchcock clearly admired this hot, young designer who was hanging on his every word in terms of filmmaking.
If I look at a Saul Bass title sequence now, I can be entertained or I can think it's beautiful without having to see the feature that comes behind it.
When you have somebody as incredibly gifted as Saul Bass collaborating with someone as incredibly gifted as Hitchcock, the results could be really extraordinary.
Saul Bass really was the first to take us into the modern sensibility.
I began as a graphic designer, and as part of my work, I created many film symbols for ad campaigns. I had felt for some time that the audience involvement with a film should really begin with the very first frame.
What was happening with Saul Bass in the 50s is that the studio film was on its way out, in a way. And what you had in the older films was kind of a credit sequence at the beginning that was almost perfunctory. It had nothing to do, really, nothing to do at all with the story of the picture. It didn't progress the psychological or emotional state of the characters in the film. It was like opening, in a wonderful classical way, opening the cover of a beautiful book. And very often you'd see films based on literature, the opening literally a book, but they were like identification tags.
So there seemed to be a real opportunity to use titles in a new way, to actually create a climate for the story that was about to unfold.
The Man with a Golden Arm woke everybody up and said, this is what the potential is for main titles. You thought this was just a throwaway kind of thing where we just put the type up and no one really designs it. And Saul Bass said, hey, wait a minute, designers, directors, here's an opportunity for us to take advantage of this real estate at the beginning of the movie and use it to help tell the story or help be the first scene or just use it to make something really interesting and beautiful. And everybody woke up.
But when Saul Bass started making credits, the credits themselves were part of the film. And they had a clarity of a modern sensibility that took you into another decade, another 2 decades ahead. Saul Bass really was the first to reflect that and destroy once and for all that old concept of opening credits.
I started in graphics. Then, as you've seen, I began to move that graphic image in film. Somewhere down the line, I felt the need to come to grips with the realistic or live-action image, which seemed to me at the time to be central to the notion of film.
Hitchcock didn't discover Saul Bass in terms of bringing a graphic designer into the movies. Saul would always say, in terms of the big break, that was Otto Preminger. By 1958, Saul Bass was the most famous graphic designer in the world.
I once saw a program of nothing but Saul Bass credits, and it was better than most movies. Just one credit sequence after another. It's astonishingly good, astonishingly varied. And probably, of them all, Vertigo is the most astonishing.
In terms of Vertigo, that was a really problematic film in terms of the studio. No one was very convinced it would do very well. So Hitchcock was concerned to make it, I think, as artistic as possible. And so he commissioned Saul Bass to do not only the titles, but also the advertising.
You have this thing with main titles, especially at that time, where the title designer will have an idea. My type is going to turn into smoke. So for 28 credits, it turns into smoke. It does something, it does the same thing, and it becomes, regardless of how clever that pun is that you come up with, main title sequences can get redundant if you do the same trick over and over again. And so Vertigo, you set it up, you have a pair of eyes, you have the eye, but you go into the eye, and then there's this kind of spiraling graphic elements internally behind the eye, but then at the end you come out of the eye again. So the fact that he at least changed it, he went somewhere, it had a beginning and a middle and an end, it makes it more interesting.
Saul said, well, you know, I'm so obsessed with my own work. I was so obsessed with these Lissajous forms for 10 years at least before I got the chance to use them, that he said I kind of knew what Hitchcock was getting at. I could be as obsessional myself over my graphic design.
Hitchcock and I never discussed Saul Bass, but it's quite obvious that Hitchcock approved of him because the designs, the psychedelic swirls in the title credits of Vertigo are simply brilliant. And they're matched by the names coming up from screen left and right and forming in Psycho and then being torn apart. These are brilliant examples of an artist at work, understanding that title designs are not simply to be inventive and impressive, they are to be thematically linked to what follows. And part of Saul Bass's genius was to understand what the movies were about and to do the designs for them appropriately.
What Saul Bass was trying to do with Psycho, as he recounted it later, was to talk about something that never quite fits. Something is not quite right. And in the movie you're going to see, you soon find out that something is not quite right. Hitchcock paid him a huge amount of money at the time, $10,000, to be visual consultant. In hourly rates, Saul was paid more than the editor. Saul was hired to do three main things, really, but the very biggest of those was the shower scene.
I believe that Saul Bass conceived the shower scene in Psycho because of how graphic it is, the upshot of the water coming out, but he didn't do it in a vacuum.
I think Saul Bass had a more modern sensibility at that time than Hitchcock, and certainly brought Hitchcock up to speed in certain more beat-oriented graphic storytelling that he could do in cinema.
I had a very pleasant meeting with Mr. Bass when I was preparing the biography of Hitchcock, and my impression was that he felt it was a great moment in his career. He was thrilled to have done it. He would have liked a little more credit, I think, but who doesn't?
That brief marriage between them is nevertheless an incredibly intense and productive one.
I think Alfred Hitchcock let him exercise his gift to its fullest, and I think the same thing with Martin Scorsese.
Come out, wherever you are.
In Cape Fear, we did a combination. It was a homage to himself. It was Elaine and Saul Bass. At that point, he was working with Elaine, his wife. And also its own film in its own right, in a way, which then somehow slipped into the close-up of her eyes, Juliette Lewis's eyes, when she starts to tell the story. And I think that was a direct reference, there's no doubt, to Hitchcock and so many of the other pictures that he made.
In Casino, it's very interesting to watch this silhouetted character descend into hell through all the Las Vegas lights. But obviously that's a metaphor for Robert De Niro's character. I think if it's just its own thing that isn't tipping its hat to the movie itself, we're not really doing our job as graphic designers.
My work on titles was a marvelous opportunity to learn about filmmaking. I think I touched about every aspect of the process, both creative and technical. And I worked with many wonderful people.
think Saul Bass is prolific, and I think that he has done work that will forever be in the canon of graphic design as groundbreaking work. And we can go back to him for inspiration.
Those credits stated that we were in a new world. And these credits are part of the story. It's part of the film. It's nothing you walk in on and talk during or just miss. No, the film is beginning, and we're part of the picture.
Edith Head showed Hollywood how to dress.
With Hitchcock and Edith Head, there is that sense of it being a true professional marriage.
Hitchcock was at home when his collaborators were storytellers. He understood that she was one of them, and he welcomed her in helping him design these Adam and Eves for his little biblical tales of doom.
Both men and women in Hitchcock's films, designed by Edith Head, have all of the trappings of what is required of a gentleman, what is required of a lady.
It's a field in which nobody remembers some of the most glorious designers, but Edith Head is always remembered.
Well, if there's one thing I know, it's how to wear the proper clothes.
Edith did an enormous number of films, more than any other person in history, way more than any other person in history.
Not only did she do hundreds of films as a department head at Paramount and at Universal, she was spearheading costume designing as a profession, as an art form. She turned the light on Hollywood glamour.
The job of a costume designer is to identify, to explain visually what the story is about, who the characters are, by what they're wearing. Is it morning, is it night, are they rich, are they poor? This is all part of the costume designer's job.
One of the great qualities of a wardrobe designer is to assume the fact that they are storytellers. Edith Head understood that every piece of fabric, every swatch of color told a story.
As a costume designer, you're the extra dimension to a character. So you tell secrets, you tell stories. You can very subtly give all sorts of information about a character. You look at somebody like Tippi Hedren in The Birds and you know exactly who she is. When you see her costume, you know that she is pretty held together, you know that she's of a certain class, but you also know that she is a woman who could be intimidated, and I think that is due to the textures that were used, the way they were used, the colors that were used, and I think that if we can give this extra sense, our job becomes much, much more valid than just putting pretty people into pretty costumes.
Why don't I slip into something more comfortable?
By all means. Edith started out at Paramount in 1923 as a sketch artist, so she started designing clothes for difficult actresses who didn't get along with Travis Banton, who was the main designer there, or for unimportant actresses or small pictures. As time went by, she, as well as other designers, had to get used to the director having an input in what they designed.
The first time Edith Head worked with Hitchcock was on Notorious in 1946. And she was still working with him. She didn't do every picture, but she did very many of them, right? And including the last one, Family Plot.
Everything to be able to work again and again with the same director. Only good things come out of this. And to have done 11 films with the same masterly director, a director who was considered God among directors, it did nothing but enhance her career hugely.
In Rear Window, Alfred Hitchcock was very clever. They showed a lot of cottons and lower echelon type of people. It was very warm, and there were a lot of colors around. James Stewart's in his pajamas, and then in walks Grace Kelly in a white and black cocktail dress. Beautiful tulle, black feathers. She looks like Hollywood glamour.
It's right off the Paris plane. You think it'll sell?
Around this old wood and browns and colors that are all around her, she pops right out. That was designed.
Preview of coming attractions.
Hitchcock said that Grace Kelly's character in Rear Window should evoke the feeling of a piece of Dresden china, beautiful but untouchable. And that's what Edith did for her, until the very end where you see her in the blue jeans and the pink blouse. But it shows how strong this woman has become from her experience in this particular mystery. Doris Day in The Man Who Knew Too Much, and later on Tippi Hedren in The Birds, wear the same costume through most of the film. It had to be something that the audience didn't get tired of, that supported the characterization. For Doris Day, it was a gray silk suit, and originally Edith had many more touches on it. She had a belt, she had a scarf around the neck. I guess with Hitchcock's prodding, she took those things off to make the thing simpler. He and she both liked a color called Eau de Nil green, and we see Grace Kelly wearing an Eau de Nil green outfit in Rear Window, and Tippi Hedren wears Eau de Nil all through The Birds.
Most people, when they look at The Birds and see the suit that Tippi is wearing, don't even notice that there is not this costume change, because you, by that point, are on a journey. And I think one of the lessons to the costume designer is to sometimes sit in the background and let the story do the talking.
There's a very, very famous Edith Head story about the making of Vertigo.
When Vertigo started out, the leading lady was to have been Vera Miles, and Edith made the whole wardrobe for her and tested it and everything. And then Miss Miles had to leave the production because she was pregnant. And so Kim Novak was very hurriedly borrowed from Columbia.
It was well known that when Kim Novak was cast, she had not been Hitchcock's first choice. So she came with a slight chip on her shoulder.
Well, you've got a nerve. Follow me right into the hotel and up to my room. Now, you beat it.
Added to which, it was also well known that Kim Novak hated grey. And the one message that Edith had from Hitchcock was that he wanted her in grey.
You want me to be dressed like her?
Judy, I just want you to look nice. I know the kind of a suit that'd look well on you.
No, I won't do it.
At the time, of course, Kim Novak was the top star in Hollywood, and she was a serious actress about her craft. And when she was told that Hitchcock wanted to put blonde wigs on her and wear a gray dress with a white underscarf and blouse, she felt that was inappropriate, that she'd look washed out.
And Edith Head went back to Hitchcock and said, you know, this actress does not want to wear grey. She will be very happy to wear any other color. And he said, I don't mind what color she wears as long as it's grey.
And in the script it says that Madeleine Elster is dressed in grey and white, with her pale skin and her blonde hair, so that she looks as if she just stepped out of the San Francisco fog.
Edith Head, being the consummate diplomat, then arrived at the next meeting with an enormous range of fabrics, all in grey. And somehow, it was never mentioned again. It was somehow sorted out between the three of them without anyone having to lose any sleep about it.
Look, it's not fair. It's too late. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. It shouldn't have happened.
It had to happen. We're in love. That's all that counts.
Look, let me go, please.
Listen
let me
to
go.
Listen to
During Edith Head and Hitchcock's era, they were building stars. So they would take this beautiful specimen of a woman or a man, and they would create this wonderful world of tailoring or dressmaking around them, and they decide what their image would be.
Hitchcock encouraged Edith Head to not only design for the stars in his film, but in their lives too.
Edith Head made personal clothes for a lot of actresses that she was working with in films. In the case of Tippi Hedren, Hitchcock wanted a certain look for her for when she went to the premiere or for when she did interviews and so forth.
It says so much about his incredible masterly touch that he wouldn't even let them live their own lives without some sense that he was conducting it as a grand orchestra conductor.
Edith did not often start trends in films. She followed the Parisian trends closely. In Rear Window, Grace Kelly wears a suit that was very much influenced by what Balenciaga had just done in Paris.
Edith Head was very refined, and she had a good sense of artistic continuity and artistic balance. She studied art. She studied French. So I think when she came into costume design, she was coming at it from an art background.
I could see you looking very handsome and successful in a dark blue flannel suit.
Where I think where she was the strongest was in contemporary clothing. Whatever time she was working in, she worked in the late 20s, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, right through the 70s. When I see some of the old work, and it looks totally contemporary, she's managed never to look dated.
Edith was a conservative designer. She did not like using prints. The main one was Grace Kelly at the end of the film, where she goes to Raymond Burr's apartment.
Lisa, what are you doing?
And there she wears a very fluffy, printed dress with lots of petticoats underneath and high heels, all of which make her vulnerable. But she stayed away from them because she thought if she used a certain kind of a print, and if the film was held up for a couple of years, by the time it finally came out, the print would look passé, and she wouldn't look good.
I like when Edith Head does outfits that look like people traveling, and it's so well accessorized, and there's a scarf and a jacket, and you know, things are crisp. So when I look at The Man Who Knew Too Much, the scene when they're all together on the bus traveling through Africa, and the colors and the cottons and the women with the Muslim garb on. It's really just a great cinematic moment in costume design.
I know that people call Edith Head the master of understated style, and I think she might have called herself that too. I don't quite see it that way. I think what she does is take the American dream, the perfect household, the perfect life, the white gloves, the little hat, the perfect exterior, and just pick it up to Hollywood level. So it just walks that maybe a foot above water.
What do you think?
Well,
I will rephrase the question.
thank you.
Do you like it?
Edith was smart enough to have seen actresses like Mae West and Marlene Dietrich who created images for themselves and then stuck with them for years. And she wore the bangs because she had a very broad forehead and another hairstyle wasn't flattering to her. But also from the 50s on, she was very famous.
She would do talk shows. She would go on tours with clothes and to explain to people how to dress. She was always a star.
She created this image of herself that fascinated the public, and it was a useful thing in terms of perpetuating her career.
It's also very important to keep in mind that Edith Head, who I believe has more Academy Awards than any other person in the history of Hollywood, had a huge staff of people who actually did the work.
Look, sewing machine!
This is one of the secrets that's not supposed to be told. In her many, many, many years at Paramount and then at Universal, she had a vast number of colleagues, of elves sewing away and designing and giving her ideas. But it was her yes or no that made something possible.
One of the ladies who worked with Edith a lot making the clothes said she had no scruples, but she had charisma. And she could find something that would please the producer, the director, the star, and the cameraman. And she would change her dresses according to their wishes.
Hitchcock liked working with Edith Head because she could be relied upon to do what she was told. And if he said he wants such and such, Edith gave it to him.
Other designers wouldn't do that. They would say, listen, this is it. You change your work in order to go along with my costume. So those people had the courage of their convictions, but they didn't last as long as Edith did.
Do you really like the scarf, Mama? It's real mink. Oh, there, you look just like an old man's darling.
Edith was famous for being diplomatic and for convincing anybody that it was fabulous and everything was wonderful. I mean, she was consummate. That's where her big talent was. The stars adored her, the ones she dressed. And then as the studio systems broke up and they started to spread and they became independent freelance artists, they would request her.
One of the most important functions of a designer is to be that bridge between a director and an actor. And one of the wonderful things that Edith Head did is she gave actors more confidence. She gave them a sense that they were beautiful. She gave them a sense that they were incredibly important. And she gave them the confidence to be able to wear her beautiful clothes with joy. One of the great feelings always I have watching a Hitchcock film is that it is above reality. It is more polished than the world we know. People are more immaculately dressed. Their hair is more perfect. But you never look at them and go, who are these people? You actually accept their world. There are really very, very few directors who are real collaborators, who can actually inform their costume designers in such a way that they will produce for them the perfect costumes. I think that is the genius of his work, and certainly the genius of his work with Edith Head.
Bernard Herrmann had one of the most extraordinary careers of certainly any composer in the 20th century.
Hitchcock and Herrmann had a glorious run, the most famous collaboration between a director and a composer in history.
Bernard Herrmann knew how to get to the darker side, but also to lull you into it, not necessarily scare you right away.
Vertigo, it's possibly the most perfect film score ever made.
Bernard Herrmann was quoted as saying, "Hitchcock only finishes a film 60%. I finish it for him."
The collaboration of Bernard Herrmann with Alfred Hitchcock is historic in the movies. He was already known as a brilliant composer. He had, after all, done the scores for Citizen Kane, The Magnificent Ambersons.
Bernard Herrmann started in radio in the 40s with Orson Welles, so he had to be very visual working in radio. He had to communicate things that you couldn't communicate, obviously, that you can in a film.
Hitchcock had a career from the 1920s all the way up to the 70s, but something happened when the combination, the element of the collaboration between Bernard Herrmann and Hitchcock in that series of films up to the point in which they parted ways on Torn Curtain, he was settling in, Hitchcock had settled into he had come to he'd evolved to a certain style, and the person to weave that all together was Bernard Herrmann.
Bernard Herrmann saw himself as a key component to the story, someone who added to the story, someone who was a dramatist in the same way that the writers and the director and the actors were.
There's a simplicity of means that Bernard Herrmann uses, especially in either science fiction or horror or suspense, that focuses you on the subject.
I think when scoring is done well, as Bernard Herrmann did with Hitchcock, you could take any cue from any movie and you know what's going on in that scene if you know the film. He was very directly complimenting Hitchcock's storytelling style.
I think one reason that Alfred Hitchcock stayed with Bernard Herrmann for so many years was because he realized that this was a composer he could trust. When Hitchcock heard the score for The Trouble with Harry, he realized that he had found, in a way, his musical alter ego. It's a sign of how quickly Hitchcock embraced Herrmann into his close artistic fold that their second film together, The Man Who Knew Too Much, Bernard Herrmann not only writes the score, he appears in it as himself as the conductor in the climactic sequence at the Albert Hall.
He was so emotional, for me, real cinematic emotion, when he was, you know, when he would have these beautiful, delicate themes, but there'd be this kind of undercurrent of dread and something's gonna happen, you know. I mean, absolute movie magic stuff. And that's why Hitchcock loved them, because, you know, because Hitchcock's films were like that. There'd be so many levels going on and everything, especially when you've got so many of Hitchcock's films are so internal. You look at Vertigo, he's sitting in a car, he's only turning a wheel like this. What are you gonna do as a composer? But it's all going on in here.
Some have said that Vertigo is Bernard Herrmann's masterpiece. It's an extraordinary score, one that certainly was influential, one that was really not acknowledged at the time. No Oscar nomination, nor was there for Psycho. In fact, none of Bernard Herrmann's scores for Hitchcock received a nomination.
The film score for Vertigo is a symphony. It will rank with the best late romantic scores ever written for the operatic stage or the concert hall.
The music by Bernard Herrmann is doing something absolutely fascinating, which is it's this very simple little theme. It's varied a little bit, but mostly it kind of goes dun 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 dun. And if you play that on a piano, or if you just listen to it carefully, you'll realize that it doesn't have the traditional kind of melodic center that you expect in most popular music, and certainly in most movie music. It doesn't quite settle onto any one key. Gives you that sense from the very beginning of not quite having your feet on the ground.
Herrmann's music is not only capturing the emotional state of Jimmy Stewart's character, but it's helping reinforce the sense of an almost ghostly San Francisco.
This could never happen nowadays, but you've got, smack in the middle of Act 1 of Vertigo, you've got this scene where James Stewart's following Kim Novak. There's like 20 minutes with no talking. I mean, imagine that now in Hollywood, you know, going to a producer, we've got 20 minutes here of this scene, no one's gonna talk, we're just gonna let the composer do it, you know. Wouldn't happen.
Bernard Herrmann's score, based on Tristan and Isolde and Wagner, to a certain extent, that longing, a sense of longing, but it really works.
The story of Vertigo is so, in a way, preposterous and outrageous and absurd that this man is following a woman who thinks she's the reincarnation of a dead woman, but it's a big plot because someone else is really going to be killed. I mean, it's a very convoluted story. Well, that's all fine because the movie exists and works and thrills us on kind of a dream level. And Herrmann understood that, and he knew that we had to be pulled into a dream, into a nightmare.
Bernard Herrmann was as much a risk taker and a visionary and a forward thinker as Hitchcock was. You don't come up with a score as brutal and as memorable as the Psycho score and not have a couple of screws loose creatively in a really wonderful way.
One of the things I love about him is there's something very lateral about him and practical. You've got this scene where this guy's stabbing and jarring, you know. Somewhere along the line, he didn't overthink that. He just went for a stabbing, edgy, you know, knife-like sound with the violins hit so hard across the bridge. I mean, that's kind of the first idea you would come up with, or he would.
It's as violent as the scene, and so that's why you get people in the theater doing this. If they're not watching the visuals, they close their eyes, they're getting stabbed by the music. It's like Jaws, John Williams. If you see a fin in the water, what person on the planet doesn't hear da-dum, da-dum? Same with Psycho. My girlfriend's in the shower, I walk in, and then what's the sound you make? It's right, right, right. I mean, it's just forever those moments are associated with that music.
The screeching violins, the screeching strings, yes, scary, interesting, but that driving music is what propels the picture emotionally and psychologically. The driving in the car. That music that's driving the characters, taking the characters ineluctably to their doom.
Hitchcock was a control freak. We all know this. He wouldn't deny that. And he was frustrated because he couldn't control exactly what notes the composer wrote. He would give very precise directives, including tremolos, crescendos, but he couldn't, of course, compose the actual notes. And that's why he had such a good time with the Byrds, because he could control the notes.
In the Byrds, he chose not to use music at all. But he took it one step further and hired a composer to supervise the soundtrack for the film, even though there was no music in it.
Curiously enough, one of the things that I think defined their collaboration the most for me is the absence of score in the Byrds, which was essentially suggested by Herman. That defines him as a man with an artistic ego, but not a personal ego. That didn't say, oh, I'm gonna do such great music for you. It's almost an elegy of what it is to be a collaborator in film.
For about 2 years, there had been some tensions because Herman had scored the film Marnie in 1964, and Hitchcock had been somewhat disappointed with the score.
Hitchcock was under enormous pressure from Lew Wasserman and Universal Studios to drop this business of symphonic scores and make pop tunes. And Hitchcock didn't want pop tunes, but because his films weren't doing very well, he had to take orders.
Bernard Herrmann didn't really write tunes in his music, and that's part of why you could argue it works, particularly in the Hitchcock films, is that he writes these short phrases that he repeats over and over, changing the instrumentation and pulling you into almost a vortex of sound. But Moon River, it isn't. By the time of Torn Curtain, Hitchcock wanted some kind of commercially exploitable soundtrack, something he called in a memo a beat score. Herrmann couldn't help himself. He wrote what he thought was best for the film. Herrmann was well into a day's recording, and the musicians had all applauded. At one point, they thought the score was exceptional. Hitchcock walked in, and it's very unfortunate, but apparently he said something to the effect of, "It's no good, here's your money, we're through."
Michael.
Torn Curtain would be a much better movie had Hitchcock let Herman use that score. That's true. But still, that was not the score that Hitchcock asked for, and he was the director, just to put a little bit of a ledger on Hitchcock's side in that.
His very last film was Taxi Driver for Martin Scorsese.
We got him to come back, do a few scores. Spielberg loved him. They always tell the story, Spielberg came to the mixing room while Bernard Herrmann was there when we were mixing in the music on Taxi Driver. And Steve said, I love your work so much, and I just think it's so extraordinary, and what you did with Hitchcock and what you did in this film and that film. He goes, oh yeah, why don't you work with Johnny Williams all the time? Why don't you work with me? He was very tough.
It's interesting that Herrmann completed that score the night he died. He supervised the last recording session, went back to his hotel, and died in his sleep. And I think that tells you right there what a consummate professional he was. Not, of course, that he knew that would happen, but he would come up with something startling and brilliant, and then left.
Bernard Herrmann is one of the most influential film composers ever.
There's something in Bernard Herrmann's music that touched upon a darker, deeper side of the story.
The very particular voice, the very particular space that Bernard Herrmann Hitchcock occupied was never occupied by anyone else.
Though film fans may consider Alfred Hitchcock the solitary master of suspense, his wife, Alma Reville, was an essential ingredient in his success. As critic Charles Champlin wrote, the Hitchcock touch had 4 hands, and 2 of them were Alma's.
Hitchcock fell in love with Alma Reville when he was still quite young, and they got married, and she was always by his side.
Her judgment was sacrosanct in Hitchcock's mind.
She had been in the business actually longer than he had and worked with him on his earliest pictures.
She was the center of his life.
Alma Reville and Alfred Hitchcock worked in the same British movie studio for 2 years, but he never got up the nerve to speak to her. When the studio folded and Alma was seeking employment, she received a phone call from a man who had just been promoted to assistant director on a picture called Woman to Woman. He offered her a job as editor. That was Alma Reville and Alfred Hitchcock's first conversation and the first step in a partnership that would last over 50 years.
She was the most important person in his life, there's no question of that. She was his muse, his guide. She was a collaborator on a number, especially of his early films.
Funny how you happen to meet someone and like them and like them.
She had a lot of input into a lot of movies in a lot of different ways, partly as an advisor, and on some of the films, especially in the earlier parts of his career, really hands-on activity when the films were being made.
My mother was completely working with my father from the minute he had an idea. He would talk to her because she was a writer and see if she thought it would make a movie. And if she said yes, then he'd go ahead. If she said no, he'd forget the whole thing.
That's what's so exciting about all of this. We move as one, everything together, nothing held back.
My mother knew every single bit of the movie. She knew every single bit of the script, and she was able to pick out little things that weren't right in the movie and tell my father about them.
As Hitchcock's granddaughter, Mary Stone, has said publicly, my grandmother was the most important influence, not only in his private life, but in his business life as well.
My grandmother used to tell my grandfather exactly what she felt about a movie that he's made, whether it be costumes or script or anything. And he was always so worried about what her reaction was going to be to these movies. So he showed her a final cut of Vertigo, and it was a scene with Kim Novak walking away. She said, well, the movie is absolutely wonderful. I love everything about it, but she's looking a little big in that scene walking away, and I just don't think you should have that scene in. Well, he took it as, oh my God, she hates the movie, which she didn't, but he was so worried, and all he wanted was praise and for her to really be happy with what he made. And for the longest time, he would tell people, she hates the movie, she hates the movie.
Alma had a very keen eye, not only for the structure and the plot and for performances, but she was very good at picking up errors in continuity and things that shouldn't be seen. She was the one who noticed, for example, that after Marion Crane in Psycho is dead and her body falls over the edge of the bathtub, with her eye staring open and the camera on the floor slowly reversing away from her, was Alma who saw the shot and said, but you can see the pulse in her neck. Well, you still can, because of course, they weren't about to use a dummy, that's too silly, and they weren't about to kill Janet Leigh. So there's no way of taking out the pulse in her neck. My guess is that Hitchcock felt, quite rightly, that the audience would be in such a supreme state of shock that they wouldn't look for that. They knew she was dead and wouldn't look for, carotid artery pulsing, and they didn't.
How are you?
Charlie.
Oh,
Yeah,
at first
Jolly.
I didn't know you. I thought you were sick.
Sick?
You aren't sick, are you? Look, Pop, here he is.
My grandmother's favorite movie was Shadow of a Doubt, which was also my grandfather's favorite movie.
I don't want you here, Uncle Charlie. I don't want you to touch my mother. So go away, I'm warning you. Go away or I'll kill you myself.
They had a wonderful time making this movie. He really never liked going on location, but for this, they went up to Santa Rosa, and they lived up there while he filmed the movie. And she actually worked on the script with Thornton Wilder. She loved the fact of the man being the menace coming into the nice, small, little, sweet town. And it was one of her most memorable experiences as far as making movies. My grandmother was very proud of my grandfather. They had a love story that lasted close to 54 years. She was protective of him, but she also was so proud of what he had accomplished and how he was so loved all over the world, not just in the filmmaking world. And she really tried to keep his home calm. He would come back from the studio, they would read. They didn't go out much. They didn't go to Hollywood parties much. And she wanted to keep his life at home quiet because his life away from home was so different.
What would you think of starting off with dinner at 21?
Will you have perhaps an ambulance downstairs?
Ah, better than that. 21.
My mother was a great cook, but a very simple cook. If she had company coming in, she would make dinners.
They were both always into cooking. My grandmother especially, she just had a passion for it. And because she had a passion for it, she just loved doing it. And she was home at night. She cooked at night. And a lot of times they would cook together in the kitchen.
On the 7th of July, 1928, Alma gave birth to a daughter, Patricia Alma Hitchcock.
My mom was an only child, so she traveled with my grandparents everywhere. They included her in their lives, in everything.
Hey, Daddy, you sure I've never been to Africa before? It looks familiar.
They used to, back in the 40s, 50s, throw a lot of parties, and she was always there. She was always included. She was never sent back to her room because it was the three of them.
I'm sorry we were gone so long, but we had to go over and pick up Hank.
We used to love to sit with my grandmother because she would mention her friends just very nonchalantly that we would say, oh my gosh, because we've seen them in all these movies. She loved Grace Kelly. She was a great friend of hers. Edith Head was a wonderful friend of hers, and Edith would dress her in the most exquisite outfits. She loved Ingrid Bergman. Cary Grant, she said she used to swoon every single time she saw him. It wasn't bragging. It was just the way it was, and she wanted us to know what it was like back in the 40s, the 50s, when we were obviously not here or too young to know.
I love you, Madeline.
I love you too. Too late, too late.
No, we're together.
Alfred Hitchcock's reliance on Alma was legendary. When she contracted cancer shortly before the premiere of Vertigo, the normally unflappable Hitchcock broke down and threatened to throw himself from a window. Fortunately, Alma's treatment was a success, and the movie-making marriage continued for another 2 decades.
I was with him once. I brought a copy of one of his wonderful silent films, a comedy based on a play called The Farmer's Wife. We sat, just the two of us, and they screened The Farmer's Wife. But at one point during the screening, the little telephone rang in the screening room next to his chair, and he picked it up and listened for a minute and put it down and jumped up and said, "I have to go home, Madame wants me."
From California, the American Film Institute salute to Alfred Hitchcock.
My grandfather received the Lifetime Achievement Award from the AFI in March of 1979, and it was a full ballroom of everyone who just adored him. And he gave up to give his speech, and we assumed it was going to be thanking all the thousands of people he had worked with. And he said,
I beg permission to mention by name only 4 people who have given me the most affection, appreciation, and encouragement, and constant collaboration. The first of the 4 is a film editor. The second is a scriptwriter. The third is the mother of my daughter Pat. And the 4th is as fine a cook as ever performed miracles in a domestic kitchen. And their names are Alma Reville.
They were born in England only hours apart, and when they died, it was within 2 years of each other. Their bodies were cremated, and their ashes spread in the Pacific Ocean. As in life, so it was in death. Alma Reville and Alfred Hitchcock, together.